The next in the series of the Crimean War battles is Inkerman. This one's a little weird. It really feels like there was no strong attempt to like hold things to those standard rules. I'll talk about why in this one it's particularly odd. So even these charts kind of don't really work. At least one of them. The artillery chart's been completely replaced. What do we have here? We have very different movement allowances for all the units. They are specified up there. We could spin this so it's facing the top, but I don't know. But this one also came with a very, very configurable rule set, I would say, with a lot of options. And that may make sense because the historical battle was problematic, but if the Russians had a little bit more flexibility, or if the weather was different, major things would change. So let's take a look at the rules briefly. I don't think I'm going to play with any of the well, we'll see. But some of them are adding a lot to a system that I already feel it isn't that complicated, but I'm struggling with certain aspects of it. There were also a couple of counter mishaps. This one's missing a skirmisher indication. This one's missing or has incorrect strengths on it to begin with. And again, everything's by unit designation, and in some cases, the counter cut is bad enough that it's really hard to see, which is just a factor. All right. So first of all, they changed the movement allowances. Skirmishers have a base movement of 8. Infantry have a movement of 7. This is going to be hard. Artillery go up to 5. Cav go up to 10. But remember, unless something changes, and there are conditions where things change, but unless something changes, you disrupt if you move more than 6 with Cav. That, I don't believe, has been changed. All units have a movement allowance of 1 less than their undisrupted or disrupted rate during night or fog, and those undisrupteds are halved when disrupted, as I have not been playing. Well, I played it in Alma because it had the movement allowances on them. Balaclava did not have the movement allowances, and I just gave them their full movement allowance even when disrupted, which is obviously not correct. And then here, it at least specifies over there, but I got so used to the Alma different counters having movement allowances on them that, yeah, it fucked me up. Now, this game has a good reason not to have the movement allowances because they have these units that are skirmishers, which don't feel much like skirmishers. They feel like units that aren't formed yet, to tell you the truth. And we'll talk about that in a bit. Only Russian units can enter or exit Sevastopol or the Mammalian. Just this readout here. And they can only do it, I think, through the road. Yeah. Now, there are 2 types of roads in this game, major and minor. Yeah, which is the same as the standard. I thought they were roads and trails. I'm just used to that. Okay. Players can exit from the map. Can exit the map. You must expend movement points. Blah blah blah. Once a unit's exited, it can't come back. Up here, from 0100 to 2400, which is actually here, is considered Sevastopol's harbor, even though seems to be stuck all the way over there. No unit can enter into those hexes. We'll talk about that in a bit. I'm going to have to make a couple of counters, I think. They don't come with the game, but I want them. Exited units are not considered eliminated. You may exit your units only during the movement phase. You cannot exit off the map as a result of combat. If forced to do so, you're eliminated. Again, an initial deployment, this time without the reinforcements placed here. Now, this is the deployment for the historical scenario. Like I said, the game's configurable. Terrain effects on line of sight. The woods in this game are boulders, bushes, and 3 to 8 foot tall stunted trees. So they have less effect in blocking line of sight. Well, they have no effect. They're treated as clear when tracing line of sight. They'll still be painful to move through. And then the effects of slopes in woods hexes on line of sight are unchanged. I don't know if any of the woods, I mean, you got things like this, you know. So, yeah, I don't know. Effective ravines on line of sight. Inkerman and Victoria ridges are intersected by a number of ravines. Okay? These are included on the map are depressions and don't block line of sight from one ridge to another. When tracing line of sight across a ravine, you can ignore the first steep downslope and first steep upslope. This is just because the basic line of sight rules for the system don't actually work. So what we're going to worry about here is where we have something like this, I can see across it. Normally, that would cause some issues. Now, it will still cause issues if I'm doing an elevation change, essentially. There's a fair amount of errata on this, as with all of them, and I think there's examples and stuff which I don't usually read that have issues. Night and fog game turns. Now, we're not going to be seeing night. That's only for the optional, for the scenario where the Russians have more flexibility and show up earlier, get to redeploy better. These affect unit movement, fire combat sighting, and disruption recovery. Skirmishers may not form into battalions during a night or fog game turn. See what I mean? Like, skirmishers turn into regular units. But not really, because you don't have the counters for regular units. So you're going to have to stack them together and keep them stacked. And then they, add up. Game turns are either night or day. Day are either clear or fog. Any day game turn that's not fog is considered to be clear. Game turns 1 through 6 are night, 7 through 11 are fog. Now, there's also options to change to allow the weather to be randomized, but not just to set it as clear or something. I don't know. Night and fog on movement. The movement allowance of all units is reduced by 1. Night and fog on combat. Fire combat is shifted 1 column to the left during either of those. Russian units may not receive a regimental morale bonus for fire or melee during night and fog turns. Effective night and fog on rallying. When you're attempting to rally during night or fog, you ignore the presence of any units adjacent to it, good or bad. You add 1 to the rally die roll on night and fog turns. And disrupted units with a morale rating of 1 would not be able to be rallied. I don't know if there are any units with a morale of 1. Yeah, there are. Okay. Wonderful. Talk about crap. All right. Yeah, there's actually some options we're going to play with, like the big guns that are back here, which provide both sides with firepower. Okay. Sighting. Night and fog limits the distance that you can see. On clear game turns, sighting is unlimited. On night turns, it's 1 hex. On fog turns, it's going to be based on the number of fog turns you've had in a row. 1 or 2, it's a 1 hex range, a thick fog. But as the day goes on, they get the visibility range gets greater and greater. This makes sense. As a fog lifts, you do begin to be able to see much further. But it still provides some of the other penalties that are present. The sighting range during fog increases. Yeah, artillery units that fire at night or fog are considered spotted. Spotted units remain spotted until they're moved from the hex they're last fired on. You can sight to a spotted unit during, as though it's during a clear game turn. So once a gun fires, once an artillery piece fires, you're able to locate it and thus fire at it at range. They suggest using a piece of paper for this. I may just throw some counters out or tiddlywinks or something like that for what is spotted. Stacking. Okay. Normal stacking in this game is 1 infantry or cav, right? Now. No more than 2 units can end a phase stacked in the same hex. Not quite, but okay. They have fewer combat options than unstacked units. Okay. Whatever. No more than 2 friendly units can end a phase in the same hex. Any 2 Russian units can end a phase in the same hex. The Allied player cannot end a phase with British and French in the same hex. 2 French units can stack together only if one is the French artillery. The French don't start out on the field, but 2 British units may end a phase stacked together only if one of those units is a British artillery unit. But any British skirmisher unit may end a phase stacked with any British unit except the Light Brigade Cavalry. We'll go on because those skirmishers, if they connect with a match, with a mate, they end up being treated as one unit. That's why I say it kind of is lying. Only the bottom unit can fire or be fired on in general unless both units are artillery or both are skirmishers. If they're both artillery, the bottom unit can be fired on by any unit. If both are skirmishers, both units may fire, but they may not be fired on by the same unit. But they may not fire upon the same unit. If both are skirmishers, the bottom unit can be fired on. If the top unit of a stack is removed from the hex, either elimination or retreat, the remaining unit can then be fired upon. This is different. The original rules, if there was some artillery there and you shot it out of the way, or whatever, if the infantry was on top of the artillery, if you shot it out of the way, you couldn't then direct more fire at the next unit. So it's going to require kind of you might be allocating fire to a unit underneath, at least in your head, before you, and then not be able to shoot it. Effective stacking on melee. Both units in a stack make a melee attack. They must attack as a combined strength. They give some effect on retreat and advance, because now we've got overstacked units that can retreat. Remember, artillery can't, but these other units can, and basically it's more or less what you'd think. If 2 units retreat into a single hex, that hex has to be vacated. If actually it's only I don't know how to put it. If one unit retreats into a hex that's stacked with 2 units, you can either retreat both units or one of the units to make room. You can advance up to 2 friendly units which participated in the melee into a hex. Yeah, but again, you have to deal with the stacking limitations at the end of that. So, yeah. Stacked units are not required to advance after combat as a stack. You can advance units from different hexes or advance either. I mean, basically, many of these rules are there because the Russians are allowed to stack 2 infantry. But skirmishers can also do some of this stuff, so whatever. And finally, the Russian battalions of the same regiment that are stacked together have their morale rating raised by 1 point during fire and melee combat. This applies even if one or both units is disrupted, but they don't get this bonus in night or fog game turns because they're not really in contact at that point. So there's reasons to stiffen your units, especially shit like that. All right, I got to swap batteries, then we'll get to the skirmishers. A white paint pen, or at least check to see if my wife had one. I wouldn't be shocked if she did. I seem to remember her having one, but because this is kind of annoying. But anyway, I know I used to have one because I did a lot of SFB counters that I made myself. All right, skirmishers. Certain British units are designated as skirmishers. These units fought in a piecemeal fashion during the initial foggy hours and only managed to form into a coordinated fighting units in the morning, later in the morning, if at all. Note that these units are distinguished from weak units with similar combat characteristics, which simply happen to be under-strength battalions because they have an SK on them. A skirmisher at the bottom of a stack may only fire or be fired upon if the top unit is a skirmisher. Unstacked skirmishers attacked by fire combat have their fire attack shifted one column left in addition to any other fire combat modifications. This is the one place where they sound like skirmishers, right? They're a little better on defense against fire. On the other hand, they're very weak. But that makes sense. Skirmishers on rally. Undisrupted skirmishers do not raise the morale rating of stacked or adjacent friendly units, but they do lower the opponent's morale rating by 1. All right. Certain British battalions are represented by 2 skirmisher counters. These units can form into a single battalion during the clear game turns. You can form battalions from your skirmisher unit. The formation into a battalion happens automatically. Once the 2 skirmishers form a battalion, the 2 counters are treated as a single unit from that point on. Their fire and melee are added together and used as an integral value. It can fire and melee offensively when disrupted, ignoring any parentheses around their disrupted combat values. If the unit has now the unit has an undisrupted movement allowance of 7, as the 2 counters are now 1 unit. Skirmishers, I think, had an 8. The allied player can place a 3rd skirmisher in the same hex without exceeding the stacking limit. Because remember, you can stack together. No, 2 British units can end a phase stacked together only if one of those units is a British artillery. Any British skirmisher can end a phase stacked with any British unit except the light. Yeah, that's the one. So now, because I've formed a full unit, I can actually have 3 counters in the hex. I assume I could have an artillery instead. I don't know. It doesn't say it. It may here. No. Pickets. All right, now this is one that pisses me off. We have pickets written on the board. These are skirmishers for all effects and purposes, except they can't move and they can't be disrupted. If they're destroyed, I got to do something, like put a counter on there or something to indicate that they're not there. If Russian units destroy them in combat, they can advance into that hex. I think retreats destroy them. Victory conditions. Okay. There's geographical objectives which are scattered about in various places, some of which are under starting counters. You can see there's some up here. This is the sandbag battery. They have an optional rule having to do with that. Victory points here. They basically say this is a pointless location, but historically it was fought over very heavily. Anyway, so that's that. The Russians get points for melee strength eliminated. I'm trying to remember, because Balaclava had this too, where it was the melee strength. What were the victory points for Alma? Yeah, the points for Alma were by unit. Again, okay, that's not violating the standard rules, but it's a little weird to do. Anyway, every 3 pickets is worth a point. Artillery is worth a little bit more than, a strength point, but whatever. The hexes are actually in error. The ones that are written here, the ones on the map, are correct. If Russian units exit, and they give it 2026 and 2426. I think they got the numbers wrong. What are we on here? 22.2. Into 1826, reference Russia. Into 2026 through 2426. Should be into 1826 through 2226. This is, so it will be here to here, anywhere between those, which seems weird. I don't know why. And 25, 27 through 29 should be 23 through 27. Honestly, I feel it's any of this, but they're different points for them. Yeah, so if you exit on this side, it's worth 1 point each. And then if you exit on this side, they're worth 2 points each. And then there's this totally new thing here, which I don't know, maybe this is wrong too. If a Russian ends a movement phase in a hex without adjacent allied units, 1723, I didn't realize there were these. Wow, that's, should be 1823. Yeah, so these are the victory points back here that are marked as 1 victory point. But the victory points at the end of the game are the Lancaster battery, the barrier, and the sandbag battery. So this, and this, the 2 victory point spaces you occupy at the end of the game. These 1 point spaces are for fucking around with their camp. Just have to remember that they're different. Okay. The Allies give victory points for each battalion eliminated is just worth 1. Each light artillery is worth 4. The light plus position artillery is worth 5. The position artillery is worth 6. And then they get points for the 3 2-point hexes if they own them at the end of the game. Now, victory, the Russians have to have at least 9 victory points or else the Allies get a decisive victory. If they get under, and this is total, This is, I'm sorry, they're net victory points, not modified by the Allied victory points. If they get between 9 and 11 victory points, the Allies win at least a tactical victory. But otherwise, it's a pretty balanced victory point chart. So the Russians have to engage and get themselves some points. And they can't just take, these 3 hexes or anything. If the Brits fall back, then the Russians have to push a little harder. We'll hit the optional rules briefly at least, although I may go into ones that I'm going to do. But I'm down 2 batteries already and ready to do something else. Well, dawn has come in this rainy place. And I snoozed a couple hours, maybe. I don't know, not very long. Then had to get up to pee and couldn't get back to sleep. So, let's take a look at the optional rules. Now, these are, fully configurable. There are some that rely on others, whatever. One is variable deployment and objective value. Oddly enough, in something that has variable values, variable deployment, it says only 23.2 and 23.3, we'll see, only apply to the historical scenario, which is what I've got set up this one. The first one is to make the sandbag more and more valuable the more it's fought over. I think it's ridiculous enough that it's got any value at all, given the designer's view that it was militarily useless. It's sort of a scripting in there to make the players go for it. This is to make them go for it harder. Variable arrangement of Russian regiments. You can basically reassign. Each Russian regiment is basically a 4 hex thing, and you can alternate the pieces inside those. I think you can put different regiments in different locations if you wish. I don't feel comfortable enough, to feel like I need to change my deployment. And other than the couple of lead regiments, which are up here, they're all pretty much the same. The lead ones have a couple of good units in them, and that seems perfectly reasonable to me. Variable release of Russian regiments. This is potentially interesting. It's to create a little bit more randomness as to when the Russians show up. But it's going to generate different results, and I have no problem with it in particular. But I don't think it adds a hell of a lot, and it's going to interfere with whatever balance there might be in the scenario. So I don't know. And it's also a fairly complex set of rules. Just in terms of like wading through them, I don't see them as terribly interesting to me. The big guns. Okay. So there are 3 sources of heavy artillery influencing both sides' maneuvers. The troops ended up avoiding coming within effective range of the guns just to live. These guns would fire en masse, and we're not particularly able to concentrate their fire. A big gun can be fired in any of the owning player's offensive or defensive fire phases. They are made before regular fire combat. A unit can be attacked once in a fire phase by big guns and once by regular fire combat. It's an exception to the rule, being fired only more than once in a fire phase. That makes them particularly useful because you can get multiple results and destroy units that way, although they operate a little differently than regular guns. All their attacks have to be declared before rolling the results. Only enemy-occupied hexes can be designated, and you have to have line of sight, although there is an exception to that. Here, I don't know what it is. Their strengths are listed on the big gun combat table, which is over here. It gives their capability at range just like all other artillery does. Now there's 2 steamship markers, which we'll talk about because those are mobile. But one thing to note is that the biggest range is 10 hexes from Sevastopol. We got big guns here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Basically, we're going to play with them, but basically they're in areas that are not of interest. Right? The next is the Mamelon, which is listed as allied. Now, only the Russians were allowed to enter there. Something's wrong. I don't know if it's the big guns rules. Or that only the Russians can enter the Mamelon. I don't remember if that was... I feel like that was one of the bastions, which would be the Russians. But maybe you just trace from here because British trenches are close to it or something. But, yeah, I think that's the case because they're further back, actually. They go only out to 5 or 6 hexes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Still not going to hit anything that's particularly of interest, but it does take away a lot of flanking opportunities there. The steamships, though, give a little bit more operational capability, but again, they only go at most 7 to 8 hexes from the water. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So they can protect the Russian the Russian troops. So the Brits are kind of at the extent of where they want to be. And given that they don't have any victory points that's within the gun sections, it's really unlikely that these are going to come into play. I think that's why they're an optional rule. But if they weren't an optional rule, you might see a Russian flanking operation out here. And you might, so I like if they weren't in play, you would see something like that. And if you are going to see something like that as a possibility, not playing with the option, I feel like you need to play with the option. I need to swap batteries. Right. Now, what else do we get to? So, if you roll less than the effectiveness rating, and that's the value on here, it's not going to translate to a fire combat table roll. You disrupt an undisrupted unit in place and eliminate an already disrupted unit. Now, if you're firing, I'm trying to see the thing, there's a splash range on these. You add effectiveness ratings together of big guns if they want to hit the same thing. The target hex gets the full effectiveness rating. Each adjacent hex gets 1 less than that effectiveness rating. Run against it. So if there's a cluster of units, you can really like hit them with overlapping fire and all kind of nastiness. There's 5 big guns in Sevastopol. Each one attacks on the Sevastopol roll column. There's 2 in the Mamelon. These attack on the Mamelon Allied roll. And there are 2 Russian steamships. These are what I was going to use counters for. I was going to make counters for, and I may still do that. A steamship's effectiveness rating is affected by whether it is moored, getting underway, or mooring. And essentially, it takes a complete turn to change state from each one of those. So if you want to unmoor, then you have to get underway before you can move. Then you have to what was the order here? You have to be getting underway, then you're underway, and that's when you're allowed to move. And finally, you can be mooring. And once you're done mooring, you'll be back in the steamship moored roll. A steamship that's underway, getting underway or mooring uses the moving roll, which is less row, which is somewhat less effective. But if it's moored, it may not move until it gets underway, and you can't stop moving until you are mooring. Each of these operations takes a full game turn. They operate independently. There's no steamship counters. Again, I was going to build a couple, but I don't know. It might not be worth it. I may just throw a couple of green counters on the board as them. Steamships can only enter all sea hex sides. Now here it says the off-map areas directly north of hexes 01 through 2200 is considered all sea. The 2 up here are not, so don't worry about them. A steamship that's underway has an unlimited movement allowance and can be moved during the Russian and Allied players' movement phases if it's underway. I don't know why you'd want to do both, but whatever. The Russian player simply names the hex he's in, which may be different hexes during the offensive and defensive fire phase. There's some examples there. And some rules. The steamship Vladimir is considered moored on turn 12. And this is all example. Okay. The Allied players' big guns are depicted on the map in hexes 1825. See, now this is weird. I don't think these are correct. That's down here. I don't think these are right at all. In 1926, the guns are actually deployed off-map south of the area represented by the map. There aren't any big guns down here. But there's these Mamelon Allied, which I felt was actually the guns. They're shown in the indicated boxes solely for the purposes of determining range. 1926. Oh, here they are. Oh. Okay. So the Allied big guns could actually do something because they're defending this area. I don't know why there's a row that says Mamelon Allied. You know what it is? I bet you the Russian, I bet you this is indeed Russian big guns. There's ones in the Mamelon and the Allied big guns use that same table. Okay. That's what I'm guessing. Did they say the Russian? Yeah, there are two big guns in the Mamelon. They use the Mamelon Allied. Yeah, there's a comma between them. Okay. Never mind. I just wasn't catching that right. They're ignored for stacking zones of control, all other game functions to determine the range for an allied big gun, count the hex in which the unit is depicted, the target hex and all intervening hexes, and the allied big guns may freely fire on the hex in which it's pictured, in which case it fires at a range of 1. Terrain features do not block line of sight of the allied big guns. Night and fog do restrict the distance that they can sight. If a Russian unit is in range, its hex may be designated. Okay. And I believe that's the same as these, that line of sight is not necessary. The terrain doesn't block. Okay. So I'm going to play with those because I feel like well, first of all, the Allies have some defenses here, and the Russian guns will prevent any kind of weird Allied action out in that direction, kind of beyond where they're actually deployed. They're deployed out of range of the guns. Okay. All right. Additional night and fog complications. This creates a lot of complexity, honestly. Sighting severely restricted during the night and in the fog. All units in night fog movement allowances are equal to their clear, but basically you can make a dissolution check. You roll a die. If it's equal to or less than the dissolution number, the unit is disrupted. I don't mind this one either. This is going to be... The sighting range for the game turn less the number of hexes moved as your dissolution number. So what is that? How does that work? Immediately after an undisrupted unit ceases movement in its movement, roll for disruption. The sighting range for that game turn, which could be as low as 1, less the number of hexes moved gives a dissolution probability. Roll a die if you're equal to or less than the dissolution number. Well, that doesn't work. Like if the sighting range is 1 and I move 6 hexes, I'll have a dissolution of -5. Seems opposite of what I'd want. The dissolution is determined by subtracting the sighting range from the number of hexes moved, not the other way around. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. So, yeah. And if I get the dissolution, I end up disrupted for moving. Zone of influence of skirmishers and pickets, unstacked, undisrupted skirmishers. And a picket is an immobile, undisrupted skirmisher, possess a zone of influence instead of a zone of control. Russian units aren't required to stop when moving adjacent to one of them. However, if they begin the melee phase adjacent to them, they are required to melee attack, just like they normally would. Maneuvers. This is getting into complicated and complex stuff that, again, I just don't feel like a game of this level of detail really requires too much of this kind of thing. And it's like the Napoleon's Art of War. They did a expanded simplicity in a Moves magazine, which started adding phases to the game and all kind of stuff, which maybe I'm not too opposed to, but I kind of feel like it breaks the charm of the game by adding too much. The core system already has a fair amount of stuff going on in it. In this case, they have a march mode, which is going to allow you to use the better road movement rate. You wouldn't be allowed it otherwise. You have to pay to enter into it. You're going to have to mark the units by rotating them or something like that. I find I need to do that for regular actions in it, so I'd have to like grab march counters from some other game or something. The infantry gets a bigger movement allowance. They're not subjected to fatigue, and they're not disrupted due to movement during night or fog game turns. I'm not really convinced that being in a march formation particularly prevents you from stumbling around in the dark. Sure doesn't in the Napoleonic Brigade series night rules, but that's something different. They also have no zone of control. They can't end a movement phase stacked with other infantry. They defend as if they're disrupted, even though they're not flipped over. They can't make offensive or defensive fire. They have their attack strength shifted a column to the right when, or they take a column shift against them when they're being fired on. They may not move next to an undisrupted unit, and anything that's not in march movement treats these roads as if they're minor roads. That adds reserves, which is this weird rule that right away I looked at and said, yeah, no way I'm going to play with this. Essentially, you assign some units reserve status, and they become more valuable to kill, but if they kill anything, their kills are more valuable. I don't want to deal with that shit. And then fatigue rules, which remind me a little bit of what I was suggesting at the end of Balaclava, which was, wow, this fatigue system would be cool across the board. The problem with it is it affects all units kind of at all times, unless they're in march mode. And if you're not using the march mode rule, there's just a certain number of turns that you're fatigued in. But if it is used, you can basically operate for 10 turns in full capability. And I think the Cav always is affected by it. And the effect of the fatigue, this I wouldn't mind doing, which is, if I play without the march mode optional rule, all British and Russian units are fatigued at the beginning of the game turn 19, and French units are never fatigued. And it effectively just reduces the morale of those units by 1 point. Historical starts with everything at 0, unless Paulov has hurried. We didn't go into one of the optionals. We left something alone. Yeah, random events. Yeah, okay. So the weather of the battle can be randomized, or I guess you could just set it, I mean, if you want it. And you use a you roll a die to see if there was rain overnight, and if there was no rain the night before, all the roads count as major roads. Fog is no longer guaranteed. It's also rolled for, and it can actually fade in and out, which I'm not sure how much I believe in. And then, and you could do these separately, you roll on these random events tables, and the weather kind of affects the die roll on them. I think there's like a +1 if it's clear weather or something like that, which could change some significant factors in the way the game goes. These are rolled before the game even starts, and I'm just not like. I don't mind random events that happen throughout the course of the battle, but this is like creating a new situation. Again, it would be very interesting if I played this game a lot, right? To be able to see different circumstances arise in it. And that would be kind of cute and everything. But I don't see doing that when I'm going to just play it once. We talked about fog. We talked about maneuvers, reserves, all that. Fatigue, yeah, I'll try to remember to do the fatigue, but it comes in on turn 19. Whatever. And then they add some additional things, which is splitting fire. A single unit can split off a couple of points to fire multiple units. I don't want to do that. But it would allow you to get more effective fires, essentially. Massed fire, 2 units can deploy to the front, both of them, and thus get all their fire combined, but they end up like not stacked properly to indicate it, and I just don't want to screw around with that shit. And then there's the difference between the historical scenario and an option scenario that allows the Russians to come in, move overnight, and position themselves a little differently than they do here. Now, the historical is not just this simple, unfortunately. I've got the reinforcements set up for that, but there's a bunch of special rules for it. It starts on game turn 8, goes to 21. There are fog game turns. By the way, the fog, like I said, the more turns it lasts, the weaker the fog gets. We did talk about that. I remember talking about that. Allied player goes first. Certain British units are under movement restrictions. The Guard Brigade units, 3 back here, may not move until game turn 10. The Light Division units may not move until game turn 10. I think that's these back here, yeah. And 1 Light Brigade unit in 24-25. Oh, no. Yeah, I'm sorry, the Light Division units. The Light Brigade may not move until turn 16. That's this unit back here. All of these units defend normally. If one is attacked before its release turn, all of the units in its group are released. Each of the 2 French units entering on game turn 11 is under restrictions. The first turn it may move freely. On every succeeding game turn, the Allies roll a die for each unit to determine if it may move that turn. On a 1 through 3, it can be moved. The die is rolled each unit until the game turn after the unit ends its movement phase adjacent to one of the later entering French units. Russian units are under movement restrictions as well, and I'm running out of battery again. Salmanov's Katerinburg Regiment and Tomsk Regiment and his 2 artillery units can always move freely. I think those are the front 2. He's got 2 other regiments. They can't move until turn 9. The Vladimir until turn 11, Suzdal until turn 13, Uglies until 15, Butirsk until game turn 17. Beginning on game turn 9, any units in that final set that have not moved freely may move 1 hex east in the Russian player's movement phase unless prevented by the rules. That's covering this way. Now, he is... Somonov is these white units. This is Pavlov. We'll get to Pavlov in a minute. General Pavlov's Borodino and Tarleton may not move until 10. His remaining units may not move until 11. If any of the units listed are attacked before they can move, all the units in that letter group are released and can move freely. The 2 artillery units begin the scenario spotted in Shell Hill and Home Ridge. Fucked if I know where that is. Would really wish they do. 2315 and 2414. That's these 2. Those start spotted. Those are not Russian. But this is just special rules in general. The optional scenarios, yeah, again, it gives you the longer game. Anyway, I'm a little discouraged by the amount of rules that were present in this one. But they're doing things that I came up with as, yeah, I'd like to see some of those. It's just they're implemented in kind of painful ways. Like the random events, it's a scenario setup thing. The fatigue rules look like a lot of work for their effect. They're not like the disruptions. They're not like the overall tiredness, and there's no recovery or anything like that. I really like the idea of some kind of, yeah, the troops can't fight all day, but you can kind of bivouac them and recuperate some of their fatigue points and bring them on again. So they just don't seem as impressive as I would like them to be. All right. I guess I send this up.